Why do most developers underestimate stories? Well, in most cases, they're just estimating the implementation. So, in other words, they're imagining like implementing a console app, creating a new console app, and just implementing the logic in the application layer, like in the C sharp layer. So, for example, let's say you had a story about implementing a new validation rule, maybe adding a max length to a text box. Most developers would think that's just one if statement, so they would say this is like a 1 point story. But it could be way more than that. So, what are you going to actually put in the if block and the else block? In other words, the success case and the error case. So the success case should be easy. That's just going to continue as normal, so most likely just saving the form. But what about the error case? So are you going to implement validation on the front end and on the back end? What a lot of people don't realize is that it's really only the back end that's required, because a hacker could use an app like Postman to submit a request without even using your front end. So always do back end, and then front end is just performance enhancement in many cases. Um, but if it's going to be just a back end validation, how are you going to return that value to the front end? Are you just going to return a string showing what error message to display, or is it going to be something more strongly typed? Like maybe you could have a class where you have fields for like which field name failed validation. Maybe you have an enum for which validation rule failed, like max length, and then maybe two additional ints for the expected length and actual length. So why would you want to do it that way instead of just having a string with the error message? Well, maybe you have multiple front ends. Like maybe you have one for mobile, one for web, one for PC. I guess web and PC are the same, but there could be multiple mobile platforms like Android versus iOS and so on. Or maybe you have desktop apps. I guess that's what I meant by PC. So you have an actual desktop app for Windows and Mac OS and so on. Um, or maybe just have one front end, but maybe it has multiple languages. So in these cases, you're going to need the more strongly typed return value from the back end. So that's something that a lot of developers are not thinking about when they make the estimate. And another common mistake when you display an error message is that a lot of apps don't focus on the error message. So in other words, it doesn't auto scroll to the error message, so that can be confusing for the user. Not necessarily a bug, but not a great behavior to have, and one more detail you want to remember when you're estimating. Um, and so all that so far is just the implementation. So not only it might the implementation be bigger than you were expecting, but before you can do the implementation, you need to navigate and understand the existing code. So if you're adding this validation rule to a text box, how are you going to find the code for the form that has that text box? Is this a large application? Is this a small application? Um, how experienced are the developers? Because to be honest, if someone's straight out of college and all they've done is computer science homework, that's mainly about coding new applications. It's not about navigating existing applications that could be hundreds of files with thousands of lines. Or maybe it's an entire system of microservices where the microservices are not really micro, they're each giant applications. Um, so have you accounted for how long it might take to navigate the existing code? And um, it's not only the size of the application, but what about the code quality? Is it spaghetti code? I mean, is it actually divided up into like business layer, data layer? Um, does it have a bunch of nested loops with a bunch of break and continue, stuff like that? If so, If so, it's going to take longer to navigate the existing code and find the part that you need to change. And keep in mind, when I say spaghetti code, the logic you need to change may not even be in the application layer. It could be inside of some 1,000 line stored procedure. So that could make it take a lot longer as well. And it's not only navigating the existing code, it's also understanding the existing logic, which may involve setting breakpoints and debugging. So that could take additional time as well. And it's not only navigating the existing code, it's also navigating through the application. So how are you going to get the app to display this form that's being changed? Is it some nested dialogue? Maybe you have to click through 10 different dialogues to get to this form, and maybe each of those dialogues has 10 different fields, and maybe each of those fields has validation rules, so you can't just type in ABC into every different field. So that can add a lot of time to a story as well. So before you can even test your change, this is just getting to the app to display that form. That could take a lot of time every time you need to test it as well. And before you can even navigate to the form, you need to set up some data before you even run the application. So in the previous slide I talked about data that you paste into the app. Now I'm talking about data that you set up in the database. So to get the app to display this form, maybe there's existing data that you have to set up, and maybe that's not just a couple of tables. Maybe it's some kind of complex database relationship with many different joins, and maybe there's a lot of different schema constraints on certain fields don't allow null, and they have min length, max length, some kind of stuff like that can be built into the database. So that can also add a lot of time to a story. And so setting up data is something you need to do in order to be able to test, but so far I've just described testing the functionality. There may be additional tests required, like do you need a load test? So for this example of adding the max length rule, you are not going to need a load test for that, I don't think, but in other stories, if you are doing a performance enhancement, you really should be doing a load test to prove that you have improved the performance. A lot of developers don't, because in many cases it's just kind of obvious, like if there's a database call inside of a loop and you're gonna change that to use a table valued parameter or something like that, then for sure it's going to improve the performance, but how do you really know if you haven't proved it to yourself and you haven't proved it to the product owner by showing them the results of the load test? Then you don't really know for sure. So and then another common one I've seen is that in a lot of agile teams, they have part of their definition of done is that all stories have to be unit tested. So when you say that to a developer, they're going to assume the existing code base is injectable, right? Because in order to do unit testing, you have to have dependency injection. So you're kind of making it sound like it is, and that's sometimes not the case. And so then there's the question of, well, like, did you estimate the time to refactor the existing code, and is that actually within the scope of the story? That's another common one where I've seen developers not take that into account when estimating the story. So in conclusion, these are all the things that you're not estimating. That it's not only the coding, it's also the testing, and not only the coding, it's not just the implementation. Before you do the implementation, you have to navigate and understand the existing code. And it's the navigation, maybe you don't estimate it, but everyone does it. It's the understanding part that's even worse, that some developers will just start changing the existing code without really understanding the existing logic. And that's always dangerous to do, because your application is going to be unpredictable if you don't understand the logic that you're changing. And then remember that it's not just implementing the success case, it's implementing error cases as well, and that could be more difficult than it seems in the case of like the backend needing to return a strongly typed object for the validation message. So then you get into the testing, and remember that it's not only testing the functionality. In order to do that, you have to set up data in the database. You have to navigate through the app. That may involve pasting data into many different fields. And it's not just correct functionality. You may be testing for performance with a load test. And your correct functionality may involve unit testing as well. So these are the most common mistakes that developers make when they end up underestimating a story. And usually in the retro, they're not aware of why the story was underestimated, but it's probably one of these things that you were missing. And I'm not saying it's easy to identify all these things up front, but in hindsight, these are the most common mistakes that I see. And usually, all these things, besides just the implementation of the success case, I mean, the majority of things that I've listed are, there's many other things. There's 5 other things besides just the implementation of the success case. So that's the majority of the work. And also, that's usually what takes the majority of the time, is all these other things. It's not just the implementation, and even the implementation is not just the success case. So I hope you can keep these things in mind when you're estimating stories in future, and I hope these give you more accurate estimates. Let me know in the comments how it helps you. And if you get into coding, you can code your own video games like me. And if you want to see the game that I coded, check out the link at the end of this video, and also check out the link in the description of this video to see my game Invaders from the Third Dimension on the Steam store. See you later.